Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Sometimes I watch David when he sleeps and catch myself thinking, we're so far apart, as if invisible walls have grown between us. Our home is a perfect picture: floor to ceiling windows, a tidy garden, morning coffee on the terrace. But I feel this strange emptiness more and more, hidden behind the pristine facades of our lives. It's as if, with each passing day, we become a little more distant, like strangers. When David suggested inviting his cousin Thomas to stay with us for a couple of weeks, I felt a sense of relief. It was, at the very least, a chance to break out of the routine. I liked Thomas. He had always been easygoing, full of boundless energy, something David had been lacking lately. "I think Thomas needs a distraction," David said, filling our usual evening with casual conversation. "He hasn't left his town in a while." "Yes," I agreed, pretending to give little importance to the suggestion, though I was already imagining how Thomas might bring something new into our quiet life. "Of course, let him come." Thomas arrived on Friday evening, as always, with a smile, as if the whole world belonged to him. His voice was friendly, his gestures relaxed, but there was something in his gaze. I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes lingered on me a little longer than they should. "Savannah!" He hugged me warmly, but for just a bit too long. "You haven't changed a bit." I smiled, feeling awkward. These were common words, but they sounded different, as if they held something more. "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, looking away. "How was the trip?" "Great." His voice was soft, almost intimate. "The road was long, but worth it to see both of you." During dinner, the atmosphere was quite familiar. We talked about the weather, recent news, exchanged routine jokes. David, as always, was lost in his own thoughts, discussing something with Thomas. And I watched as their conversation became background noise, because my mind was elsewhere. Thomas was glancing at me more frequently, and I couldn't figure out if it was my imagination or if there was truly something new in his eyes. "How's work?" David asked, reaching for the bread. "I heard you had a big project." "Yes," Thomas responded, looking up from his phone. "But things are slowing down now. I've got time to relax." "Well, I hope you'll be able to unwind here." David smiled, winking at me as if everything was perfectly normal. "Of course." Thomas glanced at me and then back at David. "I already feel at home." I looked away, trying to hide my discomfort. Nothing was happening, yet I felt a strange tension, as if something was on the verge. Thomas seemed perfectly content with our company, but I couldn't help but notice that his interest was increasingly directed at me. "Savannah," Thomas suddenly addressed me as dinner was coming to an end. "Do you remember when we discussed books a few years ago? You were so passionate about a new novel that I still haven't read it. How do you feel about that genre now?" "Oh, yes." I felt my cheeks flush, recalling our conversation. It was in another time when David and I were closer. "I hardly read those kinds of books anymore. No time." "That's a shame." His voice was warm, but with a barely detectable note of regret. "You spoke so enthusiastically then, I was even a little envious of your passion." "That was a long time ago, Thomas," I responded, trying to end the conversation. "Sometimes, revisiting something old is worthwhile." His eyes lingered on me, as if he wasn't talking about books. When I finally went to bed, my thoughts were all over the place. I knew Thomas had only been here for a few hours, but his presence was already affecting me. Could I be mistaken? Or was there really something more hidden behind his words? Thomas turned out to be a far more engaging conversationalist than I remembered. Our talks weren't just filled with the usual jokes and light remarks, but they also touched unexpected depths. His interest in books, music, and art awakened long-forgotten feelings in me. Each day, our walks became more frequent. We strolled through parks, down small streets shaded by trees, and found secluded corners of the city that seemed hidden from the rest of the world. Do you remember when we talked about old music? He asked one day as we slowly walked along the shore. I always felt there was something special about your taste, something that set you apart from others. Really? I smiled, feeling a slight warmth from his words. I think it's just a habit. I've always looked for something that could touch the soul, not just entertain. Thomas stopped and looked at me intently. His gaze was soft, but there was an elusive note of something more. In that moment, I realized that our conversations were no longer just a simple exchange of pleasantries. Something deeper was beginning to happen between us, hidden beneath everyday topics. I'm glad we're talking again, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Sometimes it feels like too much time is wasted on empty words, but with you, there's always something important to discuss. You're just flattering me, I replied, trying not to show that his words had touched me deeper than I had expected. No, I'm serious. Thomas moved closer, his shoulder lightly brushing mine. I like this sense of closeness that comes from our conversations. It's as if you see things the way I do. We stopped in front of an old cottage that we had stumbled upon during one of our walks. The house looked abandoned. Weathered walls, broken windows, and an overgrown garden. Yet in this silence, in its neglect, there was something alluring, as if the place held secrets that no one else could uncover. Why don't we come back here in the evening? Thomas suggested, his voice full of implication. I flinched at the unexpected question, though part of me had anticipated it. The air was already thick with tension, something unclear yet distinctly palpable. This place seemed to draw us in, tempting us with a mystery we had yet to acknowledge. Do you want to come back here? I asked, pretending not to understand. Yes, Thomas replied, his eyes lingering on my face once again. This place, it's special. I feel like we could talk here about anything that's been troubling us. It's easy to be yourself here. I didn't know what to say. My mind was full of contradictions. On one hand, Thomas was just a family friend, my husband's cousin. But on the other hand, every word he spoke, every look he gave me, stirred something inside that I couldn't ignore. All right, I whispered, almost unaware that I was agreeing. We can come back. That response felt like it snapped the fragile thread holding back the tension between us. We stood in silence, staring at the old cottage, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would become a turning point. As we walked back home, Thomas stayed beside me, but now our silence was filled with far more meaning. We didn't speak of what we were feeling, but every step, every glance between us said far more than words ever could. What do you think about fate? Thomas asked suddenly, when we reached the entrance of our house. Fate? I repeated, surprised by the question. Yes. He leaned in slightly, his eyes meeting mine, and I felt something tremble inside me. Do you think we meet people by chance? Or are there things that are destined to happen, no matter how we feel about them? I don't know, I replied honestly, unable to look away. Maybe something guides us through life. But don't we have a choice? Maybe. His voice grew softer, barely audible. But what if that choice has already been made for us? At that moment, I realized that there were no more boundaries between us. Thomas wasn't just asking questions. He was stirring up feelings inside me that I had long tried to ignore. And perhaps our evening at the old cottage would be the answer to his words. We returned to that very same cottage by the river in the evening, just as we had agreed. The sun was already setting, painting everything around us in warm orange and pink hues. The silence of this place seemed to envelop us, isolating us from the rest of the world. Thomas walked beside me, his steps measured as usual, but I felt something shifting inside me. Anticipation, nervousness, excitement. We went inside. The smell of old wood, damp earth, and stagnant air immediately filled my lungs. I didn't know why we were here. Well, I knew. But I was afraid to admit it even to myself. It felt like stepping into the unknown, into an abyss from which there was no return. "It's a beautiful place, isn't it?" Thomas said softly, walking over to the window, through which the last rays of the setting sun barely filtered. "Yes," I replied, trying not to look at him, avoiding his gaze that seemed to burn right through me. "It's peaceful here." But the peace was only on the surface. Inside me, everything was boiling. My heart was beating too fast. My thoughts were tangled. What am I doing here? Why did I come? I knew the answer, but my mind stubbornly refused to accept it. Thomas stepped closer to me, so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. My legs felt glued to the floor, and I couldn't move back. His presence was so overwhelming that everything around us ceased to exist. "Savannah." His voice was soft, but carried a hint of something deeper, something hidden beneath the words, "I need to tell you something." I didn't respond. Too many emotions were raging inside, and I was afraid that if I spoke even a single word, they would all spill out. "You feel it, don't you?" he continued without waiting for an answer. "I can't pretend anymore. I shouldn't have done this, but—" He fell silent, as if searching for the right words. But I didn't need words. Everything was clear in his gaze, in his gestures, in the way he had been looking at me all these days. "Thomas?" I tried to object, but my voice betrayed me. It sounded too weak, too uncertain. He stepped even closer, and now only a few inches separated us. His hand rose to my face, gently brushing against my cheek, and I felt everything inside me turn upside down. This gesture was too intimate, too right, and at the same time, so very wrong. "I think about you," Thomas continued, his fingers barely touching my skin. "Since the moment I arrived, you haven't left my mind. I don't know how it happened, but I can't pretend anymore that everything is the same." My heart pounded even harder. The words I had been afraid to hear were finally spoken. It was wrong, but a part of me wanted this, wanted it for a long time. "Thomas," I whispered, unable to find any other words. He slowly leaned towards me, and before I could stop him, our lips met. The kiss was brief but insistent, as if he had been holding back for so long, and finally broke free. I felt my hands trembling, my pulse pounding in my temples. Time stood still. A moment later, I pulled back, instinctively pressing my fingers to my lips, as if trying to confirm that it had really happened. My head was spinning. Everything was happening too fast. I had to leave. Now, immediately. "I need to go home," I said, stepping back, trying to regain what little composure I had left. "Savannah, wait!" Thomas took a step forward, but I raised my hand, motioning for him to stop. "No," I interrupted him, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. "This is wrong." He didn't insist, but there was so much pain in his eyes that I couldn't look at him for long. I turned and hurried towards the door, feeling the storm brewing inside me. Too many thoughts, even more emotions. When I got home, I sat in my bedroom, my face buried in my hands. The kiss, that brief but intense kiss from Thomas, wouldn't leave my mind. I kept recalling how his lips touched mine, how the warmth of his body surrounded me. It was both terrible and wonderful at the same time. What have I done? I thought, but the answer was already clear. A few days had passed since that evening at the cottage, and I tried to keep my distance from Thomas. Our home, once spacious and cozy, now felt cramped. I felt his presence everywhere, in the kitchen, the living room, even in the garden. Though I avoided his gaze and did everything to avoid being alone with him, our paths inevitably crossed. Was it just a coincidence, or were we both unconsciously seeking out these moments? I didn't know, but every time I saw him, my heart pounded as if it wanted to jump out of my chest. David, as usual, was busy with work. He noticed my tension, but chalked it up to everyday stresses. Each time, I tried to convince myself that our marriage was strong, that I loved David, that this was all just a fleeting illusion caused by Thomas's presence. But something inside me was pulling in the opposite direction, where reality lost its shape, and the forbidden became the only thing that truly excited me. One evening, Thomas suggested we go to one of those secluded rooftop cafes he had stumbled upon. David was once again held up at work, and I knew I shouldn't agree. But my words of caution got stuck somewhere halfway. Maybe I wanted this. No, it couldn't be. I knew I wanted it. We sat on the rooftop, watching as the city slowly submerged in the nightlights. Thomas was saying something about music, about a new album he'd recently heard, but my thoughts were wandering elsewhere. Everything seemed too calm, too ordinary, though inside me, a storm was brewing. "Savannah," Thomas suddenly said, pulling me from my thoughts. "You feel it too, don't you?" I froze. His words struck like lightning on a clear day. I knew this moment was inevitable, but each time he opened his mouth to talk about it, I tried to steer the conversation away. But not this time. "Thomas?" I began, feeling my heart start to race again. "This is wrong. We can't." He interrupted me, gently but firmly. "We've already crossed that line," he said, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "You know it as well as I do." He leaned in closer, and at that moment, I felt his hand on my waist. He pulled me toward him. My first instinct was to push him away, to break free from his embrace, to run as far as possible. But I didn't. My body betrayed me. It seemed frozen, yielding to his touch. "Thomas, no," I whispered, though there was more doubt than firmness in that no. He didn't listen. His hand remained on my waist, the warmth of his touch enveloping me entirely. I closed my eyes, trying to suppress the overwhelming rush of feelings. I couldn't resist any longer, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise. "You understand this is all wrong," I tried to say again, though my voice was filled with more weakness than reproach. "Wrong?" His voice was quiet, almost tender. "What's right, Savannah? Living and pretending that you're happy? Or maybe the right thing is to follow what you truly feel?" His words sank into me like poison, spreading through my veins. He was right, and that was the most frightening part. I couldn't pretend anymore that our encounters were coincidences, that this was just a temporary infatuation. There was a battle raging inside me, but with each passing moment, it weakened, and I knew the end was near. Thomas leaned in even closer, his lips only a few inches from mine. My mind screamed, "No, stop!" But my body, my heart were drawn to him. "You can't deny this anymore," he whispered, his breath brushing against my face. And I really couldn't. His lips found mine again, and this time I didn't resist. In that moment, everything disappeared. The city, the people, my husband. There was only us. I knew from this point there would be no turning back. We had crossed a line where there was no room for excuses. Thomas was no longer just my husband's cousin. He had become something more. And the scariest part was, I no longer wanted to deny it. When the kiss ended, we both sat in silence under the starry sky. I tried not to look him in the eyes, because I knew I would see the reflection of my own emotions there. Fear, desire, passion. "We can't," I started, but my words sounded too weak. "You say that, but—" Thomas took my hand again, his fingers warm. "Deep down, you know everything has changed." And I did know. Each day it became more difficult. Thomas was now an integral part of my life, and every moment I wasn't with him felt like emptiness. But this new reality brought with it heavy consequences. David had started noticing the changes, and the silence between us was growing more oppressive. He was attentive, too attentive, not like before, when his care was more out of habit than genuine interest. Now every step I took at home was under his silent watch, and I could feel it. "You're late," he said one evening when I quietly entered the house. He was sitting in the kitchen, his dinner untouched. His face was calm, but his voice carried a coldness. "Yeah, I stayed late at work." I quickly took off my coat and hung it on the hook, trying to avoid his piercing gaze. Did you see Thomas again? His question sounded almost innocent, but I knew what was behind it. This wasn't just curiosity. Yes, I answered softly, trying to keep my voice light. We went for coffee. You know how hard it's been for him lately. He's so lonely. David frowned, and I realized those words wouldn't help. He wasn't a fool, and it seemed he was no longer willing to pretend that nothing was wrong. Savannah, his voice softened, but it was no less serious. I can't help but notice how you've changed. We barely talk anymore. You're always leaving when I'm not here. Do you think I don't see it? I froze. His words, like sharp needles, pierced right into my heart. Of course, he saw everything. I had tried to hide my feelings, but they were gradually destroying our life. The walls of the house, once seeming safe and cozy, now felt like a trap where every word was overheard, every glance noticed. Nothing is happening, I lied, looking straight into his eyes. My words felt foreign, and even I couldn't believe them. Really? He stood up and slowly approached me. Because it feels like you're disappearing. I don't recognize you anymore. Savannah, what's happening to us? My hands began to tremble, and I turned away, unable to hold his gaze. This was the moment I could have told him everything, everything that was hidden behind those false meetings, behind the friendly conversations with Thomas. But the fear of destroying everything David and I had built over the years kept me in place. Everything's fine, David, I whispered, barely audibly. I'm just tired. A lot of work, the house. It'll pass. He was silent for a moment, then sighed heavily. Maybe, he finally said, but I have a feeling it's not just tiredness. I knew he was right. Nothing had been just anything since I allowed myself to be swept up in this whirlwind of feelings. Thomas. Thomas was more than just my husband's brother. His presence was everywhere, in my thoughts, in every step I took, in every decision I made. The next day, I ran into him again. We hadn't planned to meet, but our paths crossed once more. It was so predictable, and yet so painful. I stood at the intersection, staring at the glowing windows of the cafe, when suddenly I noticed him. He was walking toward me with a light smile, immediately bringing me back to that moment on the rooftop, to our kiss that had changed everything. Are you trying to run away again? He stopped beside me, his voice calm, but there was a confidence in it that made me want to flee. Thomas, I sighed, looking at him. This is too dangerous. David is starting to suspect. I can't do this anymore. Can't or don't want to. His question was simple, but behind it lay our entire history, the tense web we had woven between us. Both, I replied, feeling my heart start to race again. He stepped closer, his hand gently touching mine. I know you think about me the same way I think about you, he whispered, and his words cut through me. Inside, a storm raged. I could no longer deny that Thomas had become more to me than just an occasional companion. He was the one who had awakened something long forgotten in me, something I couldn't suppress. But with each passing day, I sank deeper into this feeling, and it was becoming harder and harder to pull myself out. I didn't reply. The silence between us was thick, like the air before a storm. We stood there, under the streetlights, and I knew that sooner or later this would all end in disaster. I woke up as the first rays of sunlight barely filtered through the thick curtains. The house was quiet. David had left for work early, as usual, leaving behind only the faint rustle of his daily routine. But even that familiar sound was nothing more than background noise, unable to drown out the chaos inside me. Thomas consumed my every thought. His presence seemed to fill the air, making every moment with him both torturous and desperately desired. I got out of bed, feeling the tension that never left me, even in the mornings. A shower. I needed a shower to wash away the anxious thoughts, if only for a little while. Water had always helped me find some semblance of peace when everything around me became too overwhelming. As I turned on the water, it immediately ran hot, enveloping the bathroom in a cloud of steam. I stepped under the stream, feeling the warm drops cascade over me, as if washing away the weight of the past few days. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that getting rid of these thoughts about Thomas wouldn't be so easy. The sound of the door opening was sudden. My heart stopped and I turned, unable to believe what I was seeing. Thomas stood at the bathroom door, his eyes full of the same tension that had been simmering between us for the past few weeks. Everything inside me tightened. "Thomas," I whispered, but my voice barely made it through the sound of the water. I was in shock. No words, no explanations, just him and me. He stepped forward, closing the door behind him. I knew I should have said something to stop him, but the words caught in my throat. I watched him as if spellbound. The water ran down my body, and in that moment, reality felt distant, blurred like the world behind fogged-up glass. Thomas approached, his face serious, filled with the same conflicted feelings I had. Water dripped from his hair onto his face, and in that moment, there was a certain truth. This was the moment when I realized that everything between us had to either end here and now, or truly begin. "I shouldn't have come in," he said quietly, but his words didn't reflect what he truly felt. I remained silent. All my willpower had left me, and I felt myself losing control. He took another step closer, and now only a few inches separated us. I could feel his breath, his warmth through the stream of water. My heart was beating so fast, it felt like it would leap out of my chest. My gaze locked with his, and in that instant, I understood that I could no longer resist this pull. All the logical reasons, all the attempts to maintain control vanished, dissolving in the hot mist. "Savannah," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible, but I knew he wasn't going to stop. He reached out and gently touched my face. The water streamed over our faces. This moment was the culmination of all the tension that had built up between us. Our emotions, our desires, all of it exploded in one brilliant burst of feeling. I knew we had crossed the line, the point of no return. But at that moment, I didn't care. It was a moment when the past disappeared and the future ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this kiss, this desire that could no longer be ignored. I knew this encounter would change everything. But in that moment, I couldn't stop, even if I had wanted to. After that morning shower with Thomas, I could no longer return to my old life. Thoughts of what had happened haunted me, seeping into every corner of my mind. Guilt and shame tore me apart, yet the memories of that closeness, of that kiss, were too vivid to forget. Thomas had become a shadow that now followed me everywhere. Even when he wasn't physically there, I could still feel his presence. It was driving me insane. Every day, I avoided running into him, hiding behind mundane tasks and excuses. David didn't notice anything, or at least he pretended not to. He still came home from work exhausted, absorbed in his own worries. But between us, there was nothing left, only emptiness and brief conversations that felt utterly meaningless. One evening, when David was working late, Thomas appeared at my house, as if he somehow knew I would be alone. I wasn't even surprised by his arrival. At some point, I realized it was inevitable. He always found a way to be near, always sensed when I was alone and vulnerable. "We need to talk," he said, not giving me a chance to avoid the conversation. His voice was serious, and his eyes held something more than just desire. I looked away, feeling a wave of tension envelop me. I couldn't meet his gaze. There was too much in it that I didn't want to see. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible, though inside, everything was in turmoil. "About us." He stepped closer to me, his presence almost unbearable. "I can't do this anymore, Savannah. I don't want to be your temporary weakness. We've gone too far to pretend this doesn't matter. I clenched my hands, trying to summon the strength to resist. His words were the truth, and that's where all the pain lay. I knew I couldn't keep pushing him away, but I also didn't know how to move forward. My heart and mind battled each other every time I thought of him, of David, of what we had done. I. I don't know how to stop, Thomas, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I never thought it would go this far. Everything that happened, it's wrong, and you know it. Wrong? He took my hand, and his touch was so strong I couldn't resist. Maybe it's wrong, but it's real. You feel the same way I do. We both know this is more than just physical attraction. I tried to pull away, but he held me tightly. His words pierced through my defenses, shattering them into pieces. You have to make a decision, he continued, his voice full of certainty. I can't be just your shadow anymore. Either you choose me, or you go back to your life with David, pretending like none of this ever happened. I stood there in silence, the words stuck in my throat. He was demanding clarity, something I couldn't give him. How could I make a choice? I knew our relationship was destructive, that it would ruin everything I had. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that without Thomas, my life would lose its meaning. The words wouldn't come. How could I tell him that I was torn between two lives, two worlds that could no longer coexist? He let go of my hand, his face becoming serious, almost pained. You have to decide, Savannah, he said. This isn't a game. You can't keep everything as it is. I won't be your temporary fling. If you're with me, be with me. If not, say it now. I felt fear rising inside me. Fear of losing everything I had built with David, and fear of losing Thomas. My emotions swirled inside me like an uncontrollable storm. I wanted to stop the whirlpool, but it had already pulled me in too deeply. I don't know how, Thomas, I finally said, unable to hold back the tears. I don't know how to end this, how to make the right choice. I'm lost. Thomas looked at me in silence, and his silence was heavier than any words. He understood that I was trapped by my own emotions, by decisions made in moments of weakness. If you don't decide, I'll leave, he said at last, his voice as firm as steel. And I won't come back. Those words pierced me. He was giving me an ultimatum, but I couldn't respond. I couldn't. My heart was torn apart, and no decision could piece it back together. When Thomas left, I was alone in a silence that felt deafening. My heart pounded too loudly, and tears streamed down my cheeks. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in a situation from which there was no escape. I always knew this day would come. Perhaps I tried not to think about it, closing my eyes to everything that was happening around me. But deep down, I knew. Every glance, every touch, every meeting with Thomas was bringing this moment closer. And now it had arrived. It was an ordinary morning. David, as usual, had left for work early, and I stayed home, trying to deal with the routine. We barely spoke these days, and the atmosphere in the house was so tense you could almost feel it physically. I knew he suspected something, but I didn't have the courage to admit it, even to myself. That day, everything changed. I heard David come home earlier than usual. The sound of his footsteps was heavy, as if every movement took effort. I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee, when he stormed into the room with a look that made my heart stop. Savannah! His voice was cold, but there was an unspeakable rage in it. Is there something you want to tell me? I looked up and met his gaze. In his eyes, I saw all the pain and fury he had been hiding for so long. In that moment, I understood. Everything I had tried to keep secret was no longer hidden. David knew. And this wasn't just a question, it was a condemnation. What are you talking about? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Without a word, he tossed his phone onto the table. The screen lit up, and I saw messages, pictures. Evidence of what had been happening behind his back all this time. How did he find out? Thomas? No, that's impossible. But somehow the truth had come to light. You think I didn't notice? His voice trembled with anger. I saw how you changed. I saw how you disappeared while I was at work. I thought maybe it was just something temporary. But now I know. All this time, you were with him. With Thomas. You betrayed me. I sat there silently, unable to speak. I felt the world collapsing around me as every attempt I'd made to hide the truth came crashing down on me. In that moment, I realized I could no longer deny reality. Everything I had feared had come to pass. You, he began, but then his voice broke, and he slammed his fist on the table, as if trying to contain the storm inside him. Why? Why Thomas? I didn't know what to say. How could I explain something I couldn't fully understand myself? My emotions, my actions, everything was wrapped in chaos. I was trapped in my own feelings, and even now, I couldn't give him a rational explanation. I didn't mean to, I whispered, feeling tears welling up. I don't know how it happened, David. You just what? He almost shouted, his eyes flashing with fury. You just decided to destroy everything we had? Do you understand what you've done? At that moment, I heard the front door slam. Thomas. He had probably heard the whole argument and now stood at the entrance, his face tense, as if he had been expecting this moment, but still wasn't prepared for it. Thomas! David turned, and the hatred in his eyes made me afraid. You're my brother. How could you? How could you do this to me? Thomas stepped closer, but his movements were slow and cautious. He didn't try to defend himself, didn't offer excuses. In his eyes, I saw only pain, the same pain that was tearing me apart from the inside. I didn't want it to happen like this, Thomas began, but his words were cut off by a swift punch from David. I gasped, but I couldn't move. Everything was happening too fast. Thomas staggered, trying to stay on his feet, but he didn't retaliate. He just stood there, arms at his sides, taking all of David's anger upon himself. Leave, David said, his voice shaking, but this time with suppressed grief. Leave and never come back into my life again. Thomas nodded silently, and without a word, he turned and walked out of the house. I watched him go, feeling everything that had connected us for the past few months crumble in that very moment. He was leaving, and with him went everything that had tied us together. When the door closed behind Thomas, I was left alone with David. He slowly turned to me, his eyes full of despair. Why? His voice was weak, almost lifeless. Was I not good enough for you? I couldn't find the words. How could I explain to him what was happening inside me? How could I tell him how I had become trapped in my own emotions and desires? All I could do was stand there before him, crushed under the weight of my guilt. I don't know, I finally said, feeling the tears stream down my cheeks. I really don't know. David looked at me one last time, and in his gaze, I saw not only pain, but also a finality. I won't be able to forgive this, Savannah, he said quietly, as if delivering a sentence. You've destroyed everything. And with those words, he turned and left, leaving me alone in the midst of the chaos. Thomas was gone, David was gone, and I stood there in our house, which now felt empty, crumbling under the weight of my mistakes. When the door closed behind me, it felt like the entire world had collapsed. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the end of the life I had known. David had thrown me out of the house, and all that remained were blurry memories of the past, which now felt foreign. I had always known this moment would come, but I never imagined it would bring such an unbearable emptiness. Everything David and I had built over the years crumbled in a matter of minutes. Weeks passed before I could reach out to Thomas again. After he had left the house, I hadn't seen him. I didn't know if he could forgive me, just as I couldn't forgive myself for ruining not only my life, but his as well. One morning, I gathered the courage to call him. The response was immediate. Hello? His voice was soft, and I felt a strange relief hearing it. How are you? I don't know, Thomas, I admitted. David filed for divorce. It's all over. I figured it would come to this. His voice was full of sympathy. I'm sorry, Savannah. A fresh wave of pain stirred within me, but at that moment, I knew I couldn't handle it alone any longer. Thomas was the only person I could turn to. We were both part of this chaos, and only he could truly understand what I was feeling. I don't know what to do, I said, feeling the tears welling up. I've destroyed everything. Savannah, don't say that. Thomas interrupted gently. We're both to blame for this, but maybe we should start over. Together. His words were unexpected, but at the same time, I realized they were the answer to all my inner turmoil. Thomas was offering me something I feared most, a second chance. A chance to fix what could still be repaired and to start fresh. Months had passed since I left the house that had once been our fortress with David. Our divorce was finalized quickly and without unnecessary disputes. David didn't want to drag the process out. I left him everything: the house, the possessions, and most importantly, our shared memories, which I could no longer bear to keep. Thomas and I decided to move to another city, far away from everything that reminded us of the past. We found a small house in the suburbs, where life moved slowly and peacefully. This place felt like a refuge from all the chaos that had surrounded us before. In this new house, I began to learn how to live again, preparing myself for new challenges. At first, it felt strange and unfamiliar, living with Thomas after everything that had happened. We were both lost, as if our lives had shattered into pieces that we were trying to put back together. But each day, I felt myself slowly recovering. Thomas was by my side, and his support helped me through the most difficult moments. We'll be okay, he said one evening, as we sat on the porch of our new house, watching the sunset. We can start over, without the past. Just live. His words seemed simple, but they held a truth I could no longer ignore. We really could start fresh. I was no longer the woman who had lost everything. I was someone else now. Someone who had found the strength to move past her mistakes and keep living. We didn't talk about David. I knew that the pain I had caused him would never disappear. But now that was part of the past, and perhaps I needed to accept it as inevitable. I had made my choice, and that choice had brought me here, to a new life with Thomas. We lived simply, without too many words, without looking back at what had been before. Sometimes I caught myself wondering how things might have turned out if I hadn't made those choices. But it no longer mattered. I couldn't change what had already happened. Now, Thomas and I were together. It wasn't easy, but we were both ready to build something new. What had once seemed destructive and painful had now become our new reality. I didn't know what lay ahead for us, but one thing I knew for sure: this was a new chapter in our lives, and it was up to us to decide how it would unfold.